Okay, well, thank you very much for coming tonight to learn more about our plan to move Ontario towards a 100% renewable electricity grid. But before I go any further, I want to break for a commercial because we need your help. We need your help to move Ontario to a renewable future. And in particular, we need your email address so we can contact you from time to time to give you updates about our campaign and to ask you to maybe contact Premier Wynne by email and ask her to do something to help us move forward to a renewable future. So we've got an email sign-up sheet. So if you'd like to help us, please sign up. If you don't want to sign up, don't. And just one last favor, if you do sign up, please print your name very clearly. You wouldn't believe how difficult it is to read some people's handwriting. Thank you.
I'm already on the list.
Okay. Okay, so we're working to move Ontario towards a 100% renewable grid. And we were established in 1997, 17 years to achieve that objective. And the first phase of our campaign was to phase out Ontario's 5 dirty coal-fired power plants. And we've achieved that now. We achieved that on April the 8th of this year when the last lump of coal was burned at the Thunder Bay coal plant. So that's a great achievement. You know, it's interesting looking back to remember that when we started out 17 years ago, all the sophisticated people, all the elites thought we didn't have a chance to win this campaign to phase out our dirty coal-fired power plants. And you know, it's not surprising that they thought that when you look at all the challenges we were up against. 17 years ago, the 5 dirty coal plants were owned by Ontario Hydro, the former Ontario Hydro, which at the time was one of the largest electric utilities in the world and one of the largest corporations in Canada. And they weren't going to just roll over and play dead. And they also have a very powerful union, the Power Workers Union, that works very hard to defend their workers' interests. And they wouldn't roll over. Everyone knows the Power Workers Union would fight very hard to save the dirty coal plants, which they did. In addition, when we started out, we did some public opinion polling, and the majority of people in Ontario didn't even know that we had dirty coal-fired power plants. But we wanted to phase them all out. And in 1997, Mike Harris was Premier of Ontario. And virtually everyone assumed that Mike Harris would never phase out the dirty coal-fired power plants to protect public health. And also, back in the 1990s, late 1990s, coal was providing Ontario with 25% of its electricity. So we weren't just making a minor request, we were making a huge request, and a request that potentially could, jeopardize our electricity reliability, jeopardize the economy. But nevertheless, we won. And there's many reasons why we won, but the major reason why we won is because we live in a democracy. And in a democracy, the politicians will always give the people what they really want. And that's why we achieved the coal phase out, and we achieved, which is equivalent to taking 7 million cars off the road. And so now we've got a new goal. Our new goal is also an ambitious goal, is to move to a 100% renewable grid by 2030. Just 16 years from now. So once again, a very ambitious goal, but I believe we can achieve it. And one of the reasons why we can achieve it is because most of our aging nuclear reactors will come to the end of their lives during the next 10 years. So we have a unique opportunity to rebuild our electric power system from the ground up. And so this gives us this great opportunity. Ontario has to make a choice about its electricity future. And there are basically 2 competing visions of how we should meet our future electricity needs. The first vision was articulated by former Premier Dalton McGuinty in his long-term energy plan. And it talks about meeting our future needs by rebuilding 10 of our aging nuclear reactors. This plan will cost us up to $83 billion, and it will push our electricity rates through the roof. So that's one vision. And the alternative vision which we're promoting is a 100% renewable grid by 2030, and to achieve it by doing energy conservation and efficiency and importing water power from Quebec. And our vision, our plan would actually lower electricity bills. Now, Ontario is very lucky. We're very lucky to be right next door to the province of Quebec, because Quebec is the fourth largest producer of water power in the world. Fourth largest producer in the world. And its electricity rates are the lowest in North America. That's our next door neighbor. And not only that, but Quebec has a large and growing surplus of water power, which it is exporting to the United States for most of it at 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Just phenomenal. We're right next door to this great source of low-cost water power. So that's the Quebec situation. Now let's turn to Ontario. Ontario Power Generation, which owns the Darlington Nuclear Station and is owned by you and me, wants to rebuild the Darlington Nuclear Station to meet our future needs. And according to OPG, that will cost $12.9 billion. And it will produce electricity at a cost of 8.9 cents a kilowatt hour, almost 9 cents a kilowatt hour, almost 3 times the price that Quebec is exporting power to the States at. So my friends, I ask you, does it make sense? Does it make sense to rebuild the Darlington Nuclear Station at a cost of almost 9 cents a kilowatt hour when our neighbors in Quebec are exporting power to the Americans at 3 cents? Well, to ask the question is to answer it. Of course it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to rebuild Darlington when we can keep our lights on at a much lower cost by importing water power from Quebec. So what we're proposing is a long-term contract with Quebec where we would pay them 6 cents a kilowatt hour. And that would be double what Quebec's getting now from the Americans. And under that deal, that would reduce our bills by $14 billion over 20 years. And also for Quebec, for Hydro-Quebec, it would raise its revenues by $14 billion over 20 years. So that's a win-win for both provinces. We're both better off, and we can cancel the Darlington nuclear rebuild project. So that's what we're promoting. We believe it's a no-brainer. And so you may start to think, okay, this guy Gibbons says he's got the solution to all our problems. We can move to a green future. We can have lower bills. Okay, well, if that's true, why is Kathleen Wynne, the Premier of Ontario, who is a smart and progressive political leader, why is she supporting Dalton McGuinty's long-term energy plan? That is, why is she supporting the rebuilding of these 10 nuclear reactors at a very high cost? Why is she doing that? Well, that's a good question. And to answer it, it's important to realize that while Premier Wynne is supporting the long-term energy plan, she has made 3 very important amendments to Dalton McGuinty's long-term energy plan. And the first important amendment, as she has said, is that the nuclear rebuilds must be done in a way that their cost overruns can't be passed on to consumers and taxpayers. They can't be passed on to you and me. And that's a very important new amendment, because every single nuclear project in Ontario's history has gone massively over budget, on average by 2.5 times, and the cost overruns are being passed on to you and me. So that was the first amendment she made to Dalton McGuinty's plan. The second amendment she made is called Conservation First. And Conservation First means you do all the cost-effective energy conservation and energy efficiency investments before you invest in new supply. And that's a radical new principle, but it's also just common sense. Because why wouldn't you do all the cost-effective conservation that could reduce our bills? I mean, it's just totally common sense. But it is a radical policy in terms of Ontario's history, because our policy has always been, in the past, nuclear first and conservation last. So that was the second big amendment that Premier Wynne made, conservation first. And the third big amendment she made is she says, we'll buy water power from Quebec if it's lower cost than the nuclear rebuilds. And again, that policy is just common sense, but it's also a huge change from the status quo, because for 100 years, we've had a policy in Ontario of electricity separatism. We've refused to do deals with Quebec. We've refused to sign long-term contracts with Quebec. So Premier Wynne made these 3 important amendments to the long-term energy plan. And they're really important because if she actually does what she said she's promised she would do, then we're going to move very quickly to a renewable energy future, and we will not rebuild any of those 10 aging nuclear reactors. So that's the really good news. So in fact, she agrees with what we're saying, or she says she does. So that's the good news. But there is a bad news story to this. This is what Premier Wynn's done. But the nuclear industry and the energy bureaucracy, the Ontario energy bureaucracies, they're trying to do their best to sabotage Premier Wynn's new plan and her new proposals. So the first proposal I said was, she said, nuclear industry, you can't pass your cost overruns onto consumers and taxpayers. But Ontario Power Generation, which owns Darlington and which is owned by the people of Ontario, they're trying to defy Premier Wynn. They've come forward with a Darlington rebuild proposal where up to 93% of the cost overruns could still be passed on to you and me. So they're defying Premier Wynn on the no cost overrun principle. No, don't pass the cost overruns on to consumers or taxpayers. Now let's turn to conservation first. We're supposed to do all the cost-effective conservation before a new supply, according to Premier Wynn. But the Ontario Power Authority, when you look at their budget for conservation, it's 80% lower than Ontario Power Generation's over 6 years. Their total conservation budget over 6 years is 80% lower than what Ontario Power Generation says will cost to rebuild Darlington. 80% lower. Well, that's not conservation first, that's conservation last again, and nuclear first. So again, the Ontario Power Authority, another energy bureaucracy, is trying to sabotage Premier Wynn's plans. And then let's get to water power from Quebec. Premier Wynn said we should import water power from Quebec if it's lower cost than the nuclear rebuilds. Well, you know what? The Ontario Power Authority, they put out a report last month which said that the water power imports from Quebec will provide us with no or virtually no economic benefits. Despite the fact that Quebec's got all this low-cost supply, electricity, that they're exporting the Americans at low cost, the OPA put out this outrageous, fundamentally misleading report saying there's very little potential for water power imports from Quebec to lower our bills and to replace the nuclear rebuilds. So again, there's another example of the bureaucracies trying to sabotage Premier Wynn's plan. But the good news is that the Premier Wynn's sticking to her guns. And you know, the OPA said last month there's no significant potential for water power imports from Quebec. But on Friday, Premier Wynn had a joint cabinet meeting with the Premier of Quebec and his cabinet, right in the Royal York Hotel, just a few blocks from here. And they signed a historic agreement to end electricity separatism and to start sharing power with the province of Quebec. The first one is a sharing agreement to meet our peak needs. Quebec's demand for electricity peaks in the winter. Ontario's peaks in the summer when our air conditioners are going full out. So what we've promised is when they need power in the winter, we'll provide them with 500 megawatts of power. When we need power in the summer, they'll provide us with 500 megawatts of power. So this is a deal, it's mutually beneficial. And they've signed this agreement. And not only that, so that will help meet the peak needs, but even more profoundly, they've agreed to try to negotiate a long-term deal for a long-term water power import agreement, which would allow us to displace some or all of the nuclear rebuilds. So this is potentially huge. We've started the process. We've ended electricity separatism, and now we're in the process of attempting to negotiate a deal that will lower our bills and move us to a renewable electricity future. So it's very encouraging. We're on the right. Premier Wynn's on the right track. She's fighting back against the bureaucrats in the nuclear industry that's trying to sabotage her plans. But now the most immediate threat from the nuclear industry and the energy bureaucracies is a potential deal with Bruce Power for the rebuilding of their Bruce B nuclear station. This deal, if it goes ahead, could mean that we remain dependent on nuclear power until 2050 and beyond. So what they've been doing, the Ontario Power Authority and Bruce Power, Since last December, they've been meeting in secret in the back rooms to negotiate a deal to finance the rebuild of the Bruce nuclear station. Now, if this deal goes ahead, it will be the biggest private sector deal in the history of Ontario. It would cost consumers $60 billion to $111 billion over 30 years. And we don't think it makes any sense. And what they're planning to do, what the Ontario Power Authority wants to do, is they want to sign this deal before there's been any public consultation, any public review. And that's just totally unacceptable. They're trying to sneak it through before people can look at it and prove that energy conservation and efficiency or water power from Quebec can keep our lights on at a much lower cost. So what we need your help now is to persuade Premier Wynne to direct the Ontario Power Authority that they can't sign this deal until it first goes to the Ontario Energy Board for a public review. So the Ontario Energy Board is given the mandate to say whether if this deal is in the public interest, or to determine if we can actually keep our lights on at a lower cost by doing energy conservation and water power imports from Quebec. And so we need to persuade Premier Wynne to send this to the Ontario Energy Board for public review, so the Ontario Power Authority just doesn't sign a deal in secret and lock us into a nuclear dependency until 2050 or beyond. So that's the big challenge that's before us right now that we need your help with. So in conclusion, I would just like to remind you, we did phase out coal in April 2014, but what most people don't realize that was Ontario's second coal phase out. We actually phased out coal once before. We did it over 100 years ago. And we did it because Sarat and Beck and Ontario Hydro developed our great hydroelectric resources at water power at Niagara Falls. And as a result, we phased out coal 100 years ago. And what we did was we created a virtually 100% renewable electricity grid for Ontario that lasted for almost 50 years. It lasted until 1960. And now, by working with Quebec, we have the opportunity to once more move our great province towards a 100% renewable electricity grid. And by working together with Quebec, we have the opportunity to make Ontario and Quebec once again the economic powerhouses of this nation. Thank you very much for your attention. If you've got any questions, I'll be pleased to answer.
Could you talk more about the Ontario Power Authority?